I never believed in fate until the night. I found something breathing beneath the snow that shouldn't have been breathing at all. My name is Evelyn Cross, and before that night, I thought I understood what darkness meant. I'd spent 3 years working the graveyard shift at St. Mercy's Way Station, an abandoned hospital from the old world, converted into a shelter for those fleeing the acid rains that had turned half the continent into a wasteland. The desperate came to us. The dying. The forgotten. Those who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. I chose the night shift deliberately. During the day, I could see too clearly what we'd become. I could see the hollow eyes, the sunken cheeks, the way hope had been scraped out of people like marrow from bone. But at night, in the dim emergency lighting, I could pretend we were all just sleeping, just resting before things got better. They never got better. It was November 7th when everything changed, my 32nd birthday, though I hadn't told anyone. There was no point in celebrations anymore. No cake, no candles, no friends gathering to sing off-key and laugh about getting older. Just another rotation of the clock in a world that had stopped caring about time. The evening shift had been too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream. I'd learned to trust that feeling over the years. Silence in a shelter full of desperate people wasn't peace. It was the held breath before a scream. I was in the medication storage room, counting pills for the third time because I kept losing track, when the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. I paused, my hand hovering over the bottle of antibiotics. Our last bottle and waited. At 11:47 p.m., the generator died. Not sputtered, not coughed, just ... like someone had flipped a switch and unplugged the world. The emergency lights kicked in a second later, weak and flickering, casting shadows that moved like living things across the cracked walls. Marcus, the only other staff member on duty, was dealing with a woman in labor on the third floor. I'd heard her screaming an hour ago, primal sounds that echoed through the empty corridors and reminded me that life still insisted on happening even when the world was ending. I was alone on the first floor with 6 sleeping patients and a building that suddenly felt far too large. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, an old thing patched so many times it was more a patch than coat in my flashlight. The batteries were low, had been for weeks, but it was all we had. The transformer was on the hill behind the hospital, a 20-minute walk through knee-deep snow on a good night. This wasn't a good night. The cold hit me like a physical blow when I stepped outside. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of heavy, wet snow that buried everything and made the world look clean, deceptively clean. Underneath that white blanket was still the same dying world, just hidden better. My breath formed clouds in the air, crystallizing almost instantly. The temperature had dropped to somewhere below 0. I'd stopped checking exact numbers because they were all equally deadly. I pulled my scarf tighter and started the climb. The wind was brutal, cutting through my layers like they were paper. I kept my head down, following the path I'd walked 100 times before. The flashlight beam bounced ahead of me, illuminating swirling snow and not much else. I was halfway up the hill, my lungs burning with cold air, when I heard it, a sound, a rasp, a breath, coming from somewhere to my right, off the main path, deeper into the darkness where the trees grew thick and the snow had drifted into small mountains. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to continue up the hill, to fix the generator, to get back to the patients who needed me, to not investigate strange sounds in the dark because that's how people die in every horror story ever told. But I've never been good at listening to my rational brain. I turned right, stepping off the path and into deeper snow. It came up to mid-thigh, making each step an exhausting battle. It's the wind howled louder here, less sheltered by the hill's slope. I had to fight to keep the flashlight steady. The sound came again, closer now, Definitely breathing, but wrong somehow. Too slow. Too deliberate. Like each breath was a conscious choice rather than an automatic function. My flashlight caught something strange. A glimmer. A reflection. I moved closer, and the beam illuminated hundreds of pieces of glass scattered across the slope like fallen stars. Sharp. Angular. Some pieces were small, like shattered window pane. Others were large, the size of dinner plates, with edges that looked sharp enough to cut bone, and then I saw him. A man. Lying in a crater of shattered glass, as if he'd fallen from a great height, and the impact had created a perfect circle of destruction around him. Half buried in snow that had turned pink with frozen blood. His clothes were torn, archaic in style. I recognized them vaguely from history books, the kind of formal wear men wore centuries ago. His skin was so pale it seemed to glow against the darkness, like marble or porcelain. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. He was clearly, obviously dead. Then his chest rose, barely, almost imperceptibly, but it rose. I dropped to my knees beside him, my medical training overriding every survival instinct. My hands moved automatically, check for responsiveness, check pulse, check breathing. I pressed my fingers against his neck, searching for a heartbeat. Nothing. No pulse. His skin was ice-cold, corpse-cold, the kind of cold that comes from the inside out. But his chest kept moving in those tiny, impossible breaths. I yanked off my glove and tried his wrist. Still nothing. I placed my hand over his heart, feeling for any movement, any sign of life. His eyes opened. They were silver. Not gray. Not blue. Silver. Like mirrors reflecting moonlight, like molten metal, like nothing I'd ever seen in a human face. They focused on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. His lips moved, cracked and bloodless, forming a single word that I had to read more than hear. Please. That word broke the spell of terror that had frozen me in place. Whatever he was, whatever impossible thing I'd found in the snow, he was suffering, and I'm a nurse. I save people. I don't abandon the wounded, no matter how strange the circumstances. Getting him out of the glass crater was dangerous. Every movement risked driving those sharp edges deeper into his flesh. I had to move carefully, testing each piece before I shifted him, trying to find a path through the scattered shards. His hand moved suddenly, faster than I expected, and touched my face. The contact sent a shock through me, not painful, but electric. His fingers were cold against my skin, and I felt something pass between us. A current. A recognition. Like two tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency. His lips moved again, and this time I heard the word Evelyn. My name. He said my name. I hadn't told him. Hadn't said anything. The identification badge on my coat was buried under my scarf. There was no way he could have known. I should have run. Should have left him there and fled back to the shelter and locked every door. But instead, I asked him how he knew my name. He didn't answer, just kept staring at me with those silver eyes. I made a decision then that changed everything. I told him I was going to get him out of there, that he needed to stay with me, stay conscious. He blinked slowly, and I took that as agreement. It took 20 minutes to free him from the glass. 20 minutes of careful lifting and shifting, of feeling those sharp edges slice through my gloves and cut my hands. I barely noticed the pain. I was too focused on the impossibility of what I was doing, moving a man with no pulse, no heartbeat, whose skin was cold as death, but whose eyes tracked my every movement with fierce awareness. When I finally pulled him clear of the crater, I had to figure out how to move him. He was tall, easily 6 feet, and solid despite his apparent pallor. I'm not a small woman, but carrying him would be nearly impossible. I told him I needed him to help me, that I couldn't carry him alone. He made a sound, something between a laugh and a cough, and managed to shift his weight slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let me maneuver him onto my back. The journey down the hill was a nightmare. Every step was agony. My legs trembled with exhaustion. My lungs burned. My hands screamed where the glass had cut them. The stranger's weight pressed down on me, his cold seeping through my coat and into my bones. Halfway down, he spoke again. His voice was rough, barely a whisper against my ear. He told me I should leave him, that I was risking myself for nothing. I told him to shut up and save his strength. He made that not quite laugh sound again. The shelter appeared like a lighthouse in the darkness, its emergency lights glowing weakly but steadily. I stumbled through the side entrance, the one we kept unlocked for late arrivals, and collapsed just inside the door. The stranger sliding off my back and onto the floor. I lay there for a moment, gasping, my body screaming with exhaustion. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, quick, purposeful. Marcus appeared around the corner, took one look at me and the stranger, and his expression hardened. Something wasn't right. Marcus was ex-military, trained to keep his face neutral in any situation, but I saw fear flicker across his features before he locked it down. He looked at the stranger and then at me, and I saw him calculate something, reach some conclusion I didn't understand. But he helped me. That's who Marcus was. Whatever his reservations, he helped. Together, we lifted the stranger and carried him to one of the medical cots in the examination room. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, the stranger looked worse. His skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, almost luminous. Deep wounds covered his body, visible through the tears in his clothing, but there was no bleeding. None at all. The wounds were dry, clean, as if cauterized. His chest still rose and fell in those slow, deliberate movements, but there was no pulse in his wrist, no heartbeat when I pressed my ear to his chest. I pulled out the thermometer, the old-fashioned kind we used because digital ones required batteries we didn't have. I placed it under his tongue and waited. When I pulled it out, it read so low, I thought it must be broken. I tried again. Same result. His body temperature was barely above freezing. Marcus whispered that this man should be dead. Everything we were seeing, the lack of pulse, the temperature, the bloodless wounds, all of it, said corpse. But his eyes were open, tracking our movements, and his chest continued to rise and fall. I knew what Marcus was thinking. I was thinking it too, but it was impossible. Those things didn't exist, couldn't exist. I told Marcus to go check on his patient upstairs, on the woman in labor. I'd stay with the stranger, monitor him, try to figure out what was wrong. Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between leaving me alone with this impossible person and his duty to his patient. Finally, duty won. He told me to call if I needed anything and left. I was alone with the stranger. For a long time, I just watched him breathe, watched his chest rise and fall in that strange, too slow rhythm. Watched his silver eyes blink occasionally, like he was reminding himself to perform that human action. Watched the way the harsh light seemed to slide off his skin rather than illuminate it. Hours passed. Time felt strange, elastic. I checked his vitals every 30 minutes or tried to. No pulse, no heartbeat, temperature unchanging, but still breathing, still conscious. I should have been terrified. Should have been screaming for Marcus, for anyone. Should have been running away from this impossible thing that couldn't exist, but clearly did. Instead, I felt an odd calm settle over me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was shock. Or maybe it was something else, that strange connection I'd felt when he touched my face in the snow. It was 4:13 a.m. when he spoke again. His voice was stronger now, less rough, though still quiet. He told me I should be running, should be screaming, should be telling everyone what I'd found. I asked him what I'd found, what he was. He smiled then, a sad, ancient expression that made him look both young and impossibly old at the same time. He told me I already knew, that I'd known since I touched him in the glass field. I whispered the word, barely able to form it. Vampire. He confirmed it with a single nod. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wind made a sound. I said it was impossible. Vampires were myths, stories, fiction. They didn't exist. He responded softly that yet here we were. And I couldn't argue with that logic. I had 1,000 questions, but only one seemed important. I asked him how long he'd been what he was. How long he'd been dead but breathing. Impossible but real. 217 years, he told me. His name was Dorian. He'd been turned in 1808, in a small village in England that no longer existed, by a vampire who had immediately abandoned him. He'd spent the first 50 years trying to die, and the next 150 trying to figure out how to live. I asked about the glass field, about why he'd been lying there, half buried and broken. His expression darkened. The glass on that hill wasn't glass, he explained. It was bone, fossilized bone. The remains of a vampire colony that had lived there over a century ago, before the acid rains, before the world started dying. They'd been a sanctuary, he said. 23 vampires who had chosen to exist alongside humans without causing harm. They fed on animals, on donated blood, on anything but human prey. They helped the local community, protected them from bandits and sickness, used their strength for building and their immortality for teaching. For 30 years, it worked. Humans and vampires, coexisting peacefully. Then they were betrayed. A member of the community, angry about something trivial, told vampire hunters about the colony. The hunters came at dawn with UV lights and silver weapons and fire. By sunset, 22 vampires were dead, their bodies left to fossilize in the sun. Only one survived, Dorian's sister Mara. She'd been away, hunting in the forest. When she returned and found the slaughter, she gathered the remains and built that memorial on the hill. Then she threw herself into a UV chamber and joined her family in death. Dorian had been wandering when it happened. He arrived 2 days later to find his sister dead and the colony destroyed. He'd been guarding the remains ever since, for 200 years, making sure no one disturbed the memorial. 3 nights ago, vampire hunters had found him. They were a new breed, young, aggressive, equipped with modern weapons and old hatred. They'd tracked him to the glass field and attacked. He'd fought back, but there were too many. They'd driven him into the fossilized remains and left him there, impaled on the bones of his sister's family, waiting for the sun to finish what they'd started. I felt ice water run through my veins as he finished the story. I asked if the hunters knew about the shelter, if they'd followed him here. His silver eyes met mine, and I saw the truth before he spoke. They were already here, outside, watching, waiting for dark so they could finish the job without the risk of him fleeing into daylight. I asked how long we had. He estimated 3 hours, maybe 4 before sunset. Then they'd come. The implications crashed over me. 63 people in this shelter, 6 patients too sick to move. A woman in labor upstairs. Marcus. Me. All of us in danger because I'd brought a wounded vampire into our sanctuary. I should have regretted my decision. Should have wished I'd left him in the snow. Instead, I felt a fierce protective instinct surge through me. I'd saved him. He was my responsibility. And I'd be damned if I let anyone hurt him, more the people in this shelter. I asked what we should do, how we could prepare, how we could fight. Dorian looked at me for a long moment, something like respect flickering in those silver eyes. He said he'd fight. Would do everything in his power to protect this place. But I shouldn't count on him surviving. He was weak, wounded, outnumbered. The best he could do was buy time for everyone to evacuate. I told him firmly that I wouldn't let him sacrifice himself for us, that we'd find another way. He asked if I had any other ideas, any weapons, any way to fight vampire hunters equipped with UV weapons and silver ammunition. I didn't, but I told him we'd prepare anyway. We'd fortify, we'd make plans, we'd give ourselves the best chance possible. He studied me for another moment, then nodded slowly. He told me to show him the shelter's layout. Every entrance, every exit, every weakness. I spent the next 20 minutes walking him through the building, the main entrance on the east side, the service entrance on the west, the loading dock in the back, the windows most boarded up but some still accessible, the roof access, the basement passages that connected to the old tunnel system beneath the hospital. Dorian listened carefully, his analytical mind clearly cataloging every detail. He pointed out weak points I hadn't considered, suggested defensive positions, identified the safest areas for civilians. When we finished, I asked what he needed from me, what I could do to help. He said I needed to gather everyone on the first floor, move them away from the exterior walls, away from windows, into the most defensible position possible. Keep them calm, keep them quiet, and most importantly, keep them from interfering when the fighting started. I asked if he really thought he could fight off multiple hunters alone, wounded as he was. He gave me that sad smile again and said he'd been doing impossible things for 2 centuries. This was just one more. I gathered the patients first, waking them as gently as I could and explaining that we needed to move for safety reasons. They were too weak to question much, too used to follow instructions in a world where disobedience meant death. I settled them in the old cafeteria, the room with the fewest windows and the most escape routes. Then I went upstairs to get Marcus. I found him in the delivery room, covered in blood and sweat, holding a newborn baby, a tiny, perfect thing that was screaming with healthy lungs. The mother was exhausted, but alive, smiling despite everything. I told Marcus we had a problem downstairs. He looked at me, read something in my expression, and nodded. He handed the baby to the mother and followed me out. In the hallway, I explained everything. The vampire, the hunters, the danger. I watched his face carefully, waiting for disbelief, for rejection, for fear. Instead, Marcus just sighed deeply and asked how long we had. I told him a few hours at most. He nodded again, like I'd just told him we were low on medical supplies or needed to ration water. Then he asked what the plan was. I could have kissed him. No arguments, no accusations, no panic. Just immediate, practical acceptance and readiness to help. Together, we moved everyone to the cafeteria, all 63 residents, from the newborn baby to Mr. Chun, who was 94 and dying of cancer. We brought blankets and water and food. We locked the interior doors and barricaded the exterior ones as best we could. When everyone was settled, I stood in front of the crowd and explained that we might be targeted by raiders tonight. That everyone needed to stay together, stay quiet, and stay in this room no matter what they heard. I didn't mention vampires or hunters. There was already enough fear in their eyes without adding impossible monsters to the mix. Before anyone could ask questions, before panic could spread, the lights went out again. Complete darkness this time. No emergency lights, no generator backup. Someone screamed. Children started crying. I heard the rustle of movement as people drew closer together in the dark. Then came sounds from above. Breaking glass. Heavy footfalls on the second floor. Shouts aggressive, male, multiple voices. And then a roar that didn't sound human, didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. The fight had begun. The sounds lasted minutes but felt like hours. Crashes that shook the ceiling and sent dust raining down on us. Violence so loud and close I could feel it in my chest. Screaming, some decidedly not, that cut off abruptly in ways that made my imagination supply terrible images. I stood with my back against the cafeteria door, my body a barrier between the sounds and the people behind me. Marcus stood beside me, a scalpel in his hand, pathetic weapon against what was happening upstairs, but it was all we had. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. We waited, hearts pounding, barely breathing. Minutes stretched, nothing. Then a knock on the cafeteria door. 3 measured taps. Dorian's voice, muffled through the wood, told me it was over. I threw the bolt and opened the door. Dorian stood there, and I had to suppress a gasp. He was covered in blood, soaked in it, dripping with it, looking like he'd bathed in red. But his silver eyes were bright, almost glowing, and he was standing straighter than before, stronger, more solid. He told me 4 hunters had fled. 2 wouldn't be fleeing anywhere. Behind me, the crowd had surged forward to see. Now they froze, staring at this blood-soaked figure in horror. I could feel their fear, thick enough to taste. I spoke loudly, firmly, told them this was the man who had just protected us, who had just fought off armed attackers so they could stay safe. The whispers started immediately. Monster, creature, not human, the accusations I'd been expecting. Dorian stood very still, his expression carefully neutral, as he endured their stares and whispers. Then he told me quietly that he needed to leave, that his presence was putting everyone in more danger. I started to argue, but he cut me off gently. The hunters who'd fled would come back with reinforcements. Next time there might be 20 of them, or 50. He couldn't defend against an army. The best thing he could do was leave, draw them away from the shelter. I told him no. Told him that leaving would just mean he'd die alone somewhere. And the hunters would come here anyway, looking for anyone who'd helped him. We were safer together. Marcus spoke up then, surprising me. He said the vampire had a point about reinforcements, but so did I about staying together. Maybe there was a middle ground. He suggested we fortify the shelter properly. Set watches. Establish safe rooms and escape routes. Prepare for the next attack instead of assuming we couldn't survive it. I looked at Dorian. He was studying Marcus with something like curiosity, clearly not used to humans who didn't immediately reject him. Finally, he agreed. One more day. One day to rest, to heal, to prepare. Then he'd reassess the situation. That day became one of the strangest of my life. We spent it transforming the shelter into a fortress. Marcus had military experience, Dorian had 2 centuries of survival instincts, and I had detailed knowledge of the building's layout. Together, we created something that might actually be defensible. We reinforced doors with metal bars scavenged from old bed frames. We created barricades at strategic choke points. We mapped out 3 different evacuation routes and made sure everyone knew them. We moved supplies to a secure room in the basement and stocked it with food, water, and medical equipment. And through it all, I watched Dorian interact with the shelter residents, watched their fear gradually shift to curiosity, then to cautious acceptance. Watched as Sarah, a young mother whose child was recovering from pneumonia, thanked him for protecting them. Watched as Chun, the 94-year-old, asked him what it was like to live for 2 centuries. Dorian answered their questions patiently, honestly. He didn't hide what he was or what he'd done. He explained that he fed on animals, on donated blood when he could get it, that he'd sworn never to take human life except in defense of others. He told them about the colony on the hill, about his sister's dream of peaceful coexistence. And slowly, tentatively, people began to soften, to see past the monster to the person underneath. By evening, we'd transformed the shelter as much as we could. The atmosphere had changed too, from terror to determination. These people had survived the acid rains, had survived the collapse of civilization, had survived a world determined to kill them. They weren't going to give up without a fight. As night fell and darkness settled over the shelter, I felt it again. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. Dorian felt it too. I saw him go very still, his head tilting slightly, listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he turned to me, and I saw terrible knowledge in his silver eyes. More hunters were coming. He could sense them. A skill vampires had apparently an awareness of threats. 10, maybe 12 of them. Better armed than the first group. Moving faster, more coordinated. They'd be here within the hour. Marcus immediately began organizing the evacuation procedures we'd planned. People moved quickly, efficiently, gathering in the basement safe room, for I stayed with Dorian in the cafeteria, watching as he stared out the boarded window toward the forest. He turned to me then, and I saw something in his expression that made my heart clench. He was saying goodbye, preparing me for what came next. He told me he couldn't win this fight. Not against that many hunters. Not with the weapons they carried. He was still weak from the previous battle, still recovering. He'd do his best, but I needed to be ready to evacuate everyone if he fell. I told him there had to be another way, some option we hadn't considered. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if I trusted him, really, truly trusted him. I said yes without hesitation. I did trust him, this impossible creature who'd chosen protection over survival, who'd spent 2 centuries guarding the dead because he'd promised his sister, who looked at me like I was something precious and rare. He explained that there was one option, one way to improve the odds. But it was terrible and irreversible, and I'd hate him for even suggesting it. He could turn me, make me a vampire. In 15 minutes, the transformation would be complete, and I'd be strong enough to fight beside him, strong enough to help him survive, strong enough to protect this place after he was gone. The catch was that I'd become what he was, a creature that existed outside normal human life, dependent on blood to survive, hunted by humans who feared what they didn't understand. I'd have to leave behind everything I knew, everyone I cared about. I'd have to watch them age and die while I stayed frozen, unchanging, immortal, and alone. He gave me 5 minutes to decide. 5 minutes to choose between a normal human death, because that's what would happen if the hunters won, and an immortal, monstrous existence. I looked around the cafeteria, looked at the 63 people sheltering in the basement below, trusting me to protect them. Looked at Dorian, this ancient creature who'd chosen compassion over cruelty, who'd risked everything to defend strangers. I thought about my life, 32 years of existing rather than living. 3 years working night shifts so I wouldn't have to see the dying world in daylight. No family, no real friends, no future to speak of. Just survival. Day after day, in a world that had stopped caring whether I lived or died. What did I have to lose, really? What was I giving up? A few more decades of watching civilization collapse? A slow death from radiation or starvation, or one of the dozen other ways this world killed people? And what would I gain? The power to actually make a difference. The strength to protect people who needed protecting. The chance to build something meaningful with someone who understood what it meant to be alone. I told Dorian to do it, to turn me. He tried to make me reconsider. Started listing all the reasons it was a terrible idea, all the ways I'd suffer, all the things I'd lose. But I cut him off. I told him I didn't want to be safe anymore. I'd spent my whole life trying to survive, trying to stay small and quiet and unnoticed. I was tired of being afraid. Tired of watching bad things happen and being too weak to stop them. I wanted to fight. I wanted to matter. And if becoming a monster was the price for that, then I'd pay it gladly. He studied my face for a long moment, searching for doubt or fear or hesitation. Then he nodded slowly. He told me it would hurt. Explained that his venom had to rewrite my entire biology, change me at a cellular level from human to vampire. My heart would stop, my lungs would cease automatic breathing, my temperature would drop. I'd feel like I was dying because, in a very real sense, I would be dying. My human self would end so something else could begin. He said the pain was indescribable, that every nerve would feel like it was on fire, that I'd want to scream and thrash and make it stop, but I had to stay still. Had to let it happen, had to hold on to consciousness through the worst of it. He said the transformation took about 15 minutes. 15 minutes of agony followed by an eternity of consequences. I told him I understood, that I was ready. He moved closer, and I saw uncertainty flicker across his face for the first time. He told me he'd done this before, decades ago, had turned someone he loved because she'd begged him to. She'd hated him afterward, hated what she'd become, walked into the sun 6 months later to end her immortal existence. He said he couldn't bear it if I did the same thing, couldn't bear being responsible for another person's transformation into something they couldn't accept. I took his face in my hands and told him I was not her, that I was making this choice with full awareness of what it meant, that whatever happened afterward, I wouldn't blame him. He kissed me, then gentle and sad and desperate, like he was trying to memorize the taste of my living breath. Then he pulled back slightly, his eyes meeting mine one last time. He told me he was sorry, for all of it. Then I felt his fangs pierce my throat. The sensation was strange at first, a sharp pain, like a needle stick, followed by a cold spreading sensation. Not unpleasant initially, almost soothing. Then the venom reached my bloodstream and everything changed. The pain came slowly at first, a building pressure behind my eyes, a tightness in my chest. Then it exploded outward from my heart like I'd been struck by lightning. My blood felt like it was boiling in my veins, like acid was dissolving me from the inside out. Every nerve ending fired at once, every muscle seized. My heart stuttered, racing faster and faster until I thought it would burst. My lungs seized, forgetting how to draw breath. I was dying. Actually, truly dying. Through the pain, I felt Dorian's presence, his arms around me, his voice in my ear telling me to stay with him, to fight, to hold on. I focused on that voice like a lifeline, using it to anchor myself to consciousness when everything in me wanted to flee into darkness. The pain continued, wave after wave, each one worse than the last. My heart stopped beating. I actually stopped, the final beat echoing through my chest like a death knell. My lungs froze mid-breath, then suddenly the pain stopped. I opened my eyes. The world had changed. Everything was sharper, clearer, brighter. I could see individual dust motes floating in the air, could hear every heartbeat in the building, 63 distinct rhythms, each unique. Could smell blood and sweat and fear and life. The hunger bloomed in my stomach like a flower opening, demanding and insistent. I could smell the blood flowing through Dorian's veins, cold and strange but still blood. Could smell the living humans in the basement, their hearts pumping rich, warm, intoxicating sustenance. My fangs extended without me consciously choosing it, sharp and ready. The hunger grew stronger, consuming every other thought. Dorian's voice cut through the haze. He told me to focus on him, to remember who I was, to remember my promise. I clung to my identity like it was the only solid thing in a liquid world. Evelyn Cross, nurse, protector, someone who saved lives, not took them. I repeated it like a mantra, using it to push back the hunger. Gradually, slowly, control returned. The hunger was still, there would always be there, Dorian told me later, but I could think around it, function despite it. Dorian told me I'd done well, that the first few moments were the hardest, when the hunger was newest and strongest. He said he was proud of me. Then he told me they were here, the hunters, at the door. We needed to go. I followed him to the main entrance, my new body moving with a grace and power I'd never experienced before. Every movement felt effortless, like I weighed nothing, like gravity was optional. We stepped outside together. 12 hunters stood in a semicircle, weapons raised. UV lights mounted on their vehicles illuminated the snow like harsh daylight. Silver bullets gleamed in magazine clips. These weren't amateurs, they were professionals, organized, deadly. One stepped forward, a tall man with a scar running down his face. He looked at me and smiled, a cruel expression that made my new predatory instincts bristle. He noted that I was a fledgling, barely transformed. "How convenient," he said. "2 kills for the price of 1. Dorian stepped slightly in front of me, his body language protective. He told them to leave, to walk away while they still could. This didn't need to end in blood. The scarred man laughed. He said this had always been going to end in blood. That's what happened when monsters tried to hide among decent people. That's what happened when creatures like us forgot our place. Dorian's voice went cold. He told them that this ended tonight, one way or another. The man agreed. This did end tonight. Then everything exploded into motion. Dorian moved with a speed I could barely track even with my new enhanced senses. He was a blur of movement, striking the first hunter before the man could even raise his weapon. I followed on instinct, my new body responding to impulses I didn't know I had. The fight was chaos. UV lights swung wildly, their beams burning wherever they touched exposed skin. Silver bullets whizzed past, deadly and precise. But we were faster, stronger, designed by centuries of evolution to be perfect predators. I moved between enemies like water flowing around stones. My hands found throats and pressure points with terrifying accuracy. My new strength made disarming them effortless. I could snap rifle barrels like twigs, crush handguns with a squeeze, but I didn't kill, not unless I had to. I disabled, I disarmed, I incapacitated. These were people, however misguided. They'd been taught to fear vampires, to see us as monsters. I couldn't entirely blame them for that. Dorian fought differently. 2 centuries of survival had taught him efficiency over mercy. He killed quickly, precisely, only taking what lives were absolutely necessary. But he took them without hesitation when required. Within minutes, it was over. 8 hunters fled into the forest, their vehicles abandoned, their courage shattered. 4 lay in the snow, unconscious or dead. I couldn't tell which, and wasn't sure I wanted to know. I stood in the snow, breathing hard even though I no longer needed to breathe, looking at the aftermath of violence around us. My clothes were torn, stained with blood. Some mine, most not. My hands trembled slightly. I should have been horrified. Should have been disgusted with myself, with what I'd become, with what I'd done. But all I felt was satisfaction. We'd protected the shelter. We'd protected the people inside. Dorian touched my shoulder gently. He told me we needed to go inside, that dawn was still hours away, but we needed to secure the area and check for wounded. We spent the rest of the night ensuring the shelter was safe. We dragged the bodies into the forest, the dead and unconscious both. Though Dorian checked pulses first and gave basic first aid to those who were merely injured. We collected abandoned weapons and secured them in a locked storage room. We checked every window, every door, every possible entry point. When dawn began breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, we returned inside. The building was still quiet. Everyone still sheltered in the basement safe room, waiting for the all-clear signal. Marcus emerged first, moving cautiously up the stairs, a makeshift weapon in his hands. He saw us and froze, taking in our blood-stained appearance, our changed nature. He looked at me specifically, and I saw the moment he realized what had happened. He asked if I'd let Dorian turn me. His voice was carefully neutral, not quite accusing, but not quite accepting either. I told him yes, that it had been my choice, my decision. He stood there for a long moment, processing. Then he nodded slowly and asked if it was over. If the hunters were gone, Dorian confirmed that the immediate threat was eliminated. But more would come. They always did. Marcus asked what we should do, whether we should evacuate, go somewhere safer. Dorian looked at me, deferring to my judgment. I realized that this was still my shelter, my community, my decision. I told Marcus to bring everyone up. We needed to have a conversation. Over the next hour, people slowly emerged from the basement. They gathered in the cafeteria, 63 faces, frightened, exhausted, uncertain. They'd heard the fighting, knew something terrible had happened, knew that things had changed. I stood before them, Dorian beside me, and told them the truth. Everything. What Dorian was, what I'd become, what we'd done to protect them. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Finally, someone spoke, a middle-aged man named David, who'd been at the shelter for 8 months. He called us monsters. Said we'd brought this danger to their door. Said we should leave before we got everyone killed. I understood his fear. Couldn't really argue with his logic. We had brought danger here. Our presence did put everyone at risk. But Marcus spoke up before I could respond. He reminded everyone that vampires weren't the ones who'd attacked the shelter. Humans had done that. Humans with weapons and hate and the absolute certainty that they were righteous. He pointed out that the only reason everyone was still alive was because 2 vampires had stood between them and a dozen armed killers. Sarah, the young mother whose child we'd saved, agreed. She said she'd watched Dorian fight, had seen him put himself between the hunters and the shelter, using his body as a shield, had seen me disable attackers without killing them when it would have been easier to just snap their necks. She asked the crowd if that's what monsters did, if protecting the innocent was monstrous behavior. The debate continued for over an hour. Some wanted us to leave, some wanted us to stay. Everyone had opinions, and everyone needed to be heard. Finally, Mr. Chun, the 94-year-old, spoke up. His voice was quiet but carried weight earned through years of survival. He said he'd lived through the collapse, through the acid rains, through the death of civilization. He'd seen real monsters, humans who'd abandoned compassion, who'd turned on each other, who'd chosen cruelty over kindness. He said he didn't care what we were. He cared about what we'd done, and what we'd done was protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. Not everyone. Some people still looked uncertain, frightened. But enough. A majority. Marcus stepped forward. He said if we were staying, we needed rules. Boundaries. Ways to ensure coexistence without constant fear. I agreed immediately. Asked what he wanted. He thought for a moment, then proposed conditions. We didn't feed on anyone without explicit, ongoing consent. We helped defend the place against any threat, not just vampire hunters. We were transparent about our nature and our needs, and we taught willing volunteers to fight so they could protect themselves instead of being dependent on us. I looked at Dorian. He nodded his agreement. I turned back to Marcus and told him we accepted. All of it. Marcus extended his hand. I shook it, feeling the warmth of his living flesh against my cold palm. He told me we had a deal. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm I hadn't expected. Life in the shelter didn't stop just because 2 vampires lived there now. People still got sick. Babies were still born. Supplies still needed to be gathered. The generator still broke down regularly. But things had changed too. Dorian and I worked the night shifts exclusively natural for creatures who couldn't tolerate daylight. We took over security, patrolling the perimeter, checking for threats. We handled the dangerous supply runs into the nearby ruins, places where human raiders or wild animals made it too risky for normal people. We fed on animals, mostly deer from the forest, rats from the basement, whatever we could catch. It wasn't pleasant, but it was sustainable. Some residents, understanding our need, offered blood donations. Small amounts, freely given, enough to supplement our diet without harming anyone. Dorian began teaching fighting techniques to volunteers. A dozen people showed up for the first session, curious and cautious. He taught them practical skills: how to disarm an attacker, how to use improvised weapons, how to move efficiently in combat. Within a month, we had a small but capable defense force. I continued my nursing work, grateful that my medical knowledge remained intact despite the transformation. If anything, my new enhanced senses made me better at diagnoses. I could hear irregular heartbeats, smell infections before they became visible, detect fever through temperature differences my living self could never have noticed. Slowly, tentatively, people's fear began to fade. They saw us working alongside them, not above them. Saw us choosing compassion when violence would have been easier. Saw us tired and frustrated and occasionally arguing with each other like any normal couple. Because that's what we'd become, a couple. It hadn't been intentional, hadn't been planned. But somewhere between the battles and the blood and the long nights spent talking about everything and nothing, I'd fallen in love with Dorian. And he, impossibly, had fallen in love with me. He told me about his human life sometimes, late at night when the shelter was quiet, about growing up in rural England in the 1790s, about his family, a mother who'd taught him to read despite being illiterate herself, a father who'd worked himself to death in a factory, 3 younger siblings who'd died of diseases that would have been easily curable a century later. He told me about being attacked by a rogue vampire who'd been too insane with bloodlust to explain what was happening, about waking up immortal and terrified with no one to guide him, about the first time he'd killed someone, drained them dry because he didn't know how to stop, and the decades of guilt that followed. He told me about finding his sister's colony 70 years after his transformation, about discovering that vampires didn't have to be monsters, that there were others who chose compassion over cruelty, about the 30 years he'd spent with them, the happiest period of his existence. And he told me about the slaughter, about arriving to find the people he'd loved reduced to fossilized remains scattered across a hillside, about the promise he'd made to his dying sister to guard their memorial until someone built something better. He looked at me when he finished that story and said he thought this might be what his sister had dreamed of. This small shelter where humans and vampires work together, not out of obligation, but choice. Where the old hatreds were set aside in favor of survival. I asked if he thought it would last. If we were building something permanent or just delaying the inevitable. He told me honestly that he didn't know. That history suggested humans and vampires couldn't coexist long-term, that fear and hatred always eventually won. But maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe we were creating something that would endure. 3 months after my transformation, Sarah came to me with a request that I should have anticipated but somehow hadn't. She wanted me to turn her. I asked her why she'd volunteer for this existence, for immortality and blood hunger and endless night. She told me about her daughter Emma, the child whose pneumonia we'd treated. Emma was getting sicker. The medications weren't working anymore. She was dying slowly, and Sarah couldn't bear watching it happen while being powerless to help. As a vampire, Sarah said, she'd be strong enough to make the dangerous journey to the pharmaceutical depot 50 miles away, fast enough to get there and back before the medicine expired, capable enough to fight off whatever threats she encountered along the way. She'd save her daughter. And afterward, she'd stay here and help protect everyone else's children too. I wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell her all the reasons it was a terrible idea. Wanted to protect her from the choice I'd made. But I remembered standing in that cafeteria 3 months ago, looking at Dorian, making my own impossible choice. I remembered how much I'd resented the idea of someone else deciding what risks I was allowed to take. I told her to think about it for a week, to really consider what she was giving up, to talk to the people who knew her, who cared about her. She agreed. And a week later, she came back with the same answer. Dorian performed the transformation. I stayed with them through it, held Sarah's hand as she screamed through the pain, whispered encouragement as her heart stopped beating. When she opened her silver eyes for the first time, I saw myself reflected back, the fear and exhilaration and terrible knowledge of what we'd become. We trained her for 2 weeks, taught her to control the hunger, to move with her new speed, to fight with her new strength. Then, we sent her on her mission. She returned 36 hours later with antibiotics that saved Emma's life. She also brought back other medicines, enough to treat half the shelter's chronic conditions. After that, things shifted again. People saw what Sarah had accomplished. Saw that vampirism wasn't just monstrosity, it was also power that could be used for good. Several others approached us about transformation. We refused most of them. Turning someone wasn't a decision to be made lightly. But we accepted one more, a man named James, who was dying of radiation poisoning and wanted to spend his remaining existence doing something meaningful. The transformation stopped the poisoning's progression, froze him in that liminal space between dying and dead. He used his immortal existence to establish supply lines, to negotiate with other shelters, to create networks that kept all of us safer. By 6 months after my transformation, there were 4 of us. 4 vampires living openly among 63 humans, working together to survive in a world that wanted all of us dead. It felt like a miracle. It felt fragile and precious and impossible. It felt like home. Dorian and I fell into patterns. We'd patrol together most nights, walking the perimeter in comfortable silence. Sometimes we'd talk about his past, about my human life, about the future we were trying to build. Other times we'd just exist together, 2 immortal creatures experiencing a momentary respite from loneliness. He taught me things my transformation hadn't included. How to move silently through the forest. How to track prey by scent alone. How to fight efficiently using leverage and speed instead of just relying on strength. How to endure the constant hunger without letting it consume my humanity. I taught him things too, though he'd never admit he needed teaching. How to trust humans again after 2 centuries of betrayal. How to hope that coexistence might work this time. How to accept kindness without waiting for the inevitable cruelty to follow. We fed each other. Not blood, but connection, understanding, love that had nothing to do with biology or destiny and everything to do with choice. We chose each other, night after night, in ways that made immortality feel less like a curse and more like a gift. One night, about 8 months after my transformation, we were on the hill, the glass field where I'd found him. The fossilized bones still glittered under moonlight. A memorial to vampires who'd tried and failed to build what we were attempting. Dorian stood among the remains of his sister's colony, his expression distant. He told me he used to come here every night when he was alone, before I'd found him. Would stand among the dead and wonder why he'd survived when they hadn't. Would bargain with the universe to trade places, to let him die so they could live. He said he'd stopped making that bargain. For the first time in 200 years, he was grateful to be alive. I asked him what changed. He looked at me, his silver eyes reflecting starlight, and said I'd changed everything. That finding me, being found by me, had reminded him why life was worth living. That building something meaningful with me and the others was the answer to the question that had haunted him for centuries. He said his sister would have liked me, would have loved what we were creating together. I felt tears prick my eyes, strange sensation for a creature whose biology no longer produced tears naturally. But emotion overrode physiology, and moisture gathered anyway. I told him I wished I'd met his sister. Wished I could thank her for raising a vampire who chose compassion over cruelty. He smiled, sad and grateful simultaneously. Then he kissed me among the bones of the dead, surrounded by evidence of failure, choosing hope anyway. We should have known it couldn't last. An old vampire named Miriam found us 9 months after my transformation. She appeared one night at the shelter's perimeter, hands raised in peace, asking to speak with whoever led the community. Marcus and I met her together, human and vampire, presenting a united front. She studied us both carefully, her ancient eyes assessing and calculating. She told us she'd been wandering for decades, alone, barely surviving. She'd heard rumors of a place where vampires and humans coexisted. She'd assumed the rumors were lies. Such things didn't exist, couldn't exist. But she had to see for herself. I asked her age. She said 260 years. She'd been part of a colony once, decades before Dorian's sister's community. They'd tried coexistence too. It had ended in fire and stakes and screaming. She said she'd spent the last century alone, convinced that vampires were meant to be solitary hunters. But loneliness had worn her down to nothing. If there was even a chance the rumors were true, she had to try. Marcus asked what she wanted from us. She said she wanted to join what we were building, wanted to contribute to work, to be part of something larger than herself again. She had skills, medical knowledge from before the collapse, languages, history, survival techniques, learned through centuries of experience. She said she understood if we refused, that trust had to be earned, especially for creatures like us. But she'd take whatever chance we'd give her. I looked at Marcus. He looked at Dorian, who'd emerged from the shelter to join us. Silently, we conferred, reading each other's body language, assessing the risk. Finally, I told Miriam she could stay. Trial period of 1 month. She'd work alongside us, prove her intentions through actions. If she caused problems, she'd leave immediately without argument. She agreed eagerly, and she kept her word. Miriam integrated into our community seamlessly. She worked the fields during the night, using her strength to clear land that human hands struggled with. She taught medical techniques I'd never learned, skills from an era before modern medicine. She shared stories that made our history real accounts of the collapse from someone who'd lived through it, witnessed civilization crumble firsthand. And she befriended Dorian. They'd sit together some nights, two ancient creatures who'd both lost their original families, who'd both survived when others hadn't. They never talked about the heavy things directly, but I'd hear fragments of conversation, remembering the taste of foods that no longer existed, missing music no one played anymore, grieving a world that had died while they'd remained unchanging. By the time her trial month ended, no one questioned whether she should stay. She was part of us, part of our strange, impossible family. We were 4 vampires and 63 humans, building something unprecedented, building hope in a dying world. For over a year, we had something rare and precious. We had home. We had purpose. We had proof that coexistence was possible. But all things end. Even miracles. The government came on a cold February night, 14 months after my transformation. 50 soldiers in armored vehicles. UV floodlights powerful enough to burn vampire flesh at 100 yards. Silver ammunition designed specifically to kill our kind. They surrounded the shelter at dawn, when we were weakest, most vulnerable. Marcus came to us in the basement where we'd taken shelter from daylight. His face was grave, his voice steady, despite the fear I could hear in his elevated heartbeat. He told us what was outside, told us they were offering terms. The humans could go free, would be evacuated to government facilities, promised safety and resources. But we had to surrender, face trial, face execution. Because that's what governments did when they feared something. They killed it. I wanted to fight. Wanted to use the year of training, the defensive preparations, the weapons we'd stockpiled. We could kill soldiers. Could probably take down half of them before they overran us. But Dorian stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. He pointed out what I'd been too angry to see, the UV floodlights, the dawn timing. The fact that fighting would mean exposing ourselves to weapons specifically designed to kill us while we were at our weakest. He said we couldn't win this fight, not like this. Not when they'd planned so carefully for our weaknesses. Sarah asked if we should run, if there were escape routes they didn't know about. I admitted there probably weren't. They'd clearly surveyed the area, planned this operation carefully. We'd be running blind into daylight with UV weapons tracking us. Miriam suggested negotiation. Maybe we could reason with them, explain what we'd built here, prove that vampires weren't threats. Dorian laughed, a bitter sound. He reminded us that governments didn't negotiate with monsters, didn't care about proof of peaceful coexistence. They cared about control, about eliminating variables, about ensuring the population that all threats were being handled. We sat in silence for a long moment, 4 vampires facing the end of everything we'd built. Finally, Dorian made the decision. He said we'd surrender, that we'd go peacefully, without resistance, without putting the humans at risk. James argued. Asked why we should give up when we could fight. Dorian told him to look around, to really see what we'd built. 63 people living in relative safety because we'd protected them. Children who'd grown stronger, elderly who'd lived longer, families who'd stayed together. Miriam's gardens providing food, Sarah's medicine runs saving lives. My medical care giving comfort. He said if we fought, soldiers would die, and then more soldiers would come. And eventually, they'd kill everyone here, human and vampire alike, just to make sure the threat was eliminated. But if we surrendered peacefully, maybe they'd leave the shelter alone. Maybe the humans would survive. Maybe what we'd built would endure even without us. Sarah asked if he was really willing to die for them, for humans who might forget us within a generation. Dorian said yes, because that's what protectors do. That's what love does. It sacrifices. It endures. It hopes that meaning survives even when the people who created it don't. We voted. 4 vampires deciding their fate. It was unanimous. We'd surrender. I told Marcus our decision. He tried to argue, said they'd fight with us if we wanted to resist, said we'd earn that loyalty. I told him gently that fighting would get everyone killed, that our sacrifice would let them survive, that we needed him to remember us, to tell people what we built here, to prove that coexistence was possible even if it didn't last. We gathered everyone one last time. 63 humans and 4 vampires standing together in the cafeteria where we'd shared meals and stories and laughter, where we'd become something more than just survivors. We'd become family. I told them we were surrendering to the government, that we were going peacefully so they'd be safe, that they shouldn't mourn us. We'd chosen this, chosen them, chosen to believe that what we'd built mattered. The room erupted in protests. People begged us to stay, to fight, to let them help. Children cried. Adults shouted. The chaos of grief and love and helpless anger. Marcus finally got everyone quiet. He stood before us, this gruff ex-soldier who'd learned to trust vampires, and thanked us. Thanked us for protecting them, for teaching them that coexistence was possible, for showing them that monsters could choose to be heroes. He promised they'd remember, would tell their children and grandchildren about the vampires who'd lived among them peacefully, would spread the truth that predators and prey could build something beautiful together. 63 faces watched us leave, some crying openly, some standing at attention and respect, all of them bearing witness to the end of an experiment that had succeeded in every way except duration. We stepped outside together, Dorian, Sarah, Miriam, and me. The UV lights hit us immediately, causing pain that made us flinch. But we kept walking, hands raised, showing we meant no violence. A colonel approached, crisp uniform, cold eyes, the bearing of someone who'd made difficult decisions and stopped caring about consequences. He told us we were under arrest for crimes against humanity. I asked about the humans, about the shelter residents. He promised they'd be safe, would be relocated to proper facilities. This place would be shut down, hazardous materials, contamination risks, all the bureaucratic excuses for destroying evidence of uncomfortable truths, but the people would live. That was something. They loaded us into armored vehicles, separating us despite our requests to stay together. Inside my transport, alone in the dark, I had time to think about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about finding Dorian in the snow, about choosing to become a vampire, about the year we'd spent building something meaningful, about love found in impossible circumstances. I didn't regret any of it, not a single choice. The containment facility was cold and sterile, all concrete and fluorescent lighting designed specifically to house supernatural prisoners. They separated us immediately, placing each of us in isolation cells with UV barriers. I spent 3 days alone. No visitors, no communication, just me and my thoughts, and the growing certainty that this was how it ended. On the 4th day, they came for us at dawn, led us through corridors to a courtyard where harsh sunlight waited. They'd placed UV shielding overhead enough to prevent immediate incineration, but not enough to make us comfortable. We'd burn slowly if this took too long. There was no trial, no lawyers, no due process, just a military tribunal that had already decided our fate. The colonel read the charges: unauthorized transformation of humans, cohabitation with civilian populations, possession of supernatural abilities. All crimes punishable by death under emergency legislation I'd never heard of. He asked if we had any final words. Miriam spoke first. She said the year at that shelter was the most meaningful of her 260 years, that she'd spent centuries existing rather than living, and our community had taught her the difference. She thanked us for giving her a purpose before the end. Sarah said she'd chosen to become a vampire to protect her daughter and help others, that she'd make the same choice again, that Emma was alive because of what we'd built together, and that mattered more than any law or tribunal decision. Dorian said his sister had died believing vampires and humans could coexist peacefully, that this past year he'd gotten to live that dream, that he'd found love and family and purpose, that he'd built something beautiful with me. He said that was worth any price. Then it was my turn. I looked at the tribunal members, at the soldiers, at the recording equipment documenting our execution. I looked at my family, 3 vampires who'd chosen compassion over cruelty. I told them I'd found something in the darkness, something beautiful and terrible and worth fighting for. I'd found love. I'd found purpose. I'd found a way to make immortality meaningful. I said we'd chosen compassion over violence every chance we got. We'd protected the vulnerable. We'd healed the sick. We'd built instead of destroyed. And if that made us monsters, then I was proud to be one. I had one last request. I asked if we could face it together. If they'd grant us that small mercy. The colonel looked at us for a long moment. Then he nodded. He told the guards to move us to the center of the courtyard together. They complied, and suddenly we were standing in a circled Orion, Sarah, Miriam, and me. Our hands found each other automatically, forming a connection that had sustained us through everything. I looked at Dorian, this ancient vampire who'd waited 2 centuries in the darkness for someone to find him. I told him I loved him, in this life and whatever came after. He smiled, that sad, beautiful expression I'd come to treasure. He told me he loved me too, thanked me for finding him in the snow that night. Thanked me for choosing to stay when leaving would have been safer. Sarah squeezed my hand, said we'd been the family she'd chosen, better than blood or obligation. Miriam said she'd been alone for so long she'd forgotten what connection felt like. She thanked us for reminding her. The UV lights powered on, full intensity, no shielding. Pure, concentrated artificial sunlight designed to incinerate vampire flesh. The pain was immediate and absolute. My skin began to burn, to blister, to crack and peel. I screamed, couldn't help it. The pain was too intense. Heard Sarah screaming beside me, heard Dorian's sharp intake of breath, heard Miriam's quiet whimper. But through the pain, I felt them, felt their hands in mine, holding tight even as our flesh burned. We weren't dying alone. We were dying together, as we'd lived, choosing each other, choosing hope, choosing love despite everything. The world narrowed to a single point, the connection between our hands, the knowledge that we'd mattered, that we'd built something beautiful even if it hadn't lasted, that we'd proven coexistence was possible even if others refused to believe it. I held on to Dorian's hand as my vision started to fade, held on to the memory of his silver eyes, held on to the certainty that this year with him had been worth an eternity of loneliness. And then, nothing. 20 years later, Marcus stood on the hill overlooking the ruins of St. Mercy's way station. The shelter had been shut down the day we'd been taken, the residents relocated to government facilities. The building had fallen into disrepair, windows broken, walls crumbling, reclaimed slowly by the forest. But someone had built something new on the glass field. 4 stone obelisks, each about 6 feet tall, standing in a square, each carved with a name and dates. Dorian, 2 centuries of existence. 1 year of meaning. Evelyn, 33 years. 1 year of true life. Sarah, 29 years. 1 year of power. Miriam, 261 years. 1 year of belonging. Marcus placed synthetic flowers at each stone, the only kind that grew anymore in this acid-soaked world. He did this every year on the anniversary, had done it for 2 decades, would continue until he died. He spoke quietly to the stones, told them about the world, about how the story had spread despite government attempts to suppress it, about how other shelters had started accepting vampires, creating similar communities, about how the idea of coexistence had taken root, grown, spread. He told them their sacrifice had mattered, that people remembered, that everyone who'd lived in that shelter for that year had spent the rest of their lives telling the story of 4 vampires who chose to be heroes. He told them about Emma, Sarah's daughter, who was 21 now and studying medicine, about how she'd dedicated her life to helping others because her mother had shown her what true sacrifice looked like. He told them about the legislation that had been passed 5 years ago, making it illegal to execute vampires without proper trials, about the slow, painful progress toward acceptance. He told them about the resistance that remained, about the hunters who still killed indiscriminately, about the fear that persisted, but also about the hope, about the proof that their year together had provided. The wind howled across the glass field, making the fossilized bones sing. Marcus liked to think it was them, the 4 vampires and the colony that had died before, them trying to say they understood, that they were at peace, that their dreams lived on even though they didn't. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A piece of glass near Dorian's obelisk, larger than the others, with something preserved inside. He picked it up carefully. Inside the translucent fossil was an impression. 2 faces pressed close together, features blurred by time but intimate in arrangement. Maybe Dorian and his sister? Maybe 2 members of her colony. Or maybe just coincidence, random patterns in ancient bone. But Marcus preferred to believe it was intentional. A reminder that love persisted even when everything else crumbled. That connection survived death. He smiled and placed the glass back carefully, positioning it so light would catch the preserved faces. Then he walked down the hill, back to a world that was still dying but somehow still worth fighting for. Because 4 vampires had taught him that survival wasn't enough. That you had to build something beautiful in the darkness. Had to find meaning even in a meaningless world. Had to love even when love was impossible. Had to believe that somewhere, somehow, those 4 creatures were together, were at peace, were proud of what they'd built, even if it had lasted only a year, were home.